Well, hello, Endow ladies. Simone here, Director of Program Growth, and I'm joined today by Mary Eberstadt, who I'm very happy to see again, even though it's seeing through Zoom, because the last time I saw her, and the first time I met her, was in Krakow in Poland during the Tertio Millennium seminar in 2019. And Mary, I was just saying how happy I was that I was able to participate in that before COVID, and hopefully you'll be back in Poland this summer, although who knows?
Who
Um,
does, Simone? But it's wonderful to see you again. And let me get in a plug for the Tertio Millennial program because there's nothing like it in the world. And it's a life changer, as you know.
yes, it absolutely is. And I'll link to it from this episode. But for those who are just being introduced to Mary, Mary is a senior research fellow at the Faith and Reason Institute in Washington, D.C. And she's the author of the new book, Primal Screams: How the Sexual Revolution Created Identity Politics. And her other books include It's Dangerous to Believe, How the West Really Lost God, and Adam and Eve After the Pill. And her writings are all over the place, so I'm sure that you know who she is. But her work can also be found on her website, maryeberstadt.com. And here's a picture of the book that I own. And Mary, when I became a DRE at a parish, the first event that I had for my catechists, I wanted to call them the catechist soirees, was actually a little discussion on this book, Adam and Eve After the Pill, The Paradoxes of the Sexual Revolution. So there are so many more things that you've written and have spoken about. And so this was a very frustrating interview to think about because we had to just choose a few things. But I think one of the things that's most on the hearts and minds of our women is that you're such a, I don't know if it's right to call a woman, a feminine genius or expresses the feminine genius, but either way, you are one. And so we want to hear a little bit of your story and how I would say the Holy Spirit led you to your personal vocation in writing and speaking and studying these things and sharing it with us in the world. So if you don't mind, I'd love to hear a little bit of your story.
Oh, thank you, Simone. So part of my story is that I'm a wife and mother of four, and my children, who are mostly grown now, have always been a great source of inspiration for me. And through them, I've gotten to know, of course, a lot of people their ages. And it is a preoccupation with those people that has led to some of my work as well. Uh, as far as the Catholic side of things, there's a kind of interesting story, I guess. I've always been writing. I've written in just about every genre except for poetry. I've written fiction and nonfiction and essays and books. But about, I guess, 12 years ago, my writing took a new turn. The editor of First Things magazine asked me if I would write a 40th anniversary piece about the release of Humane Vitae. And I said, sure, I'd be happy to write an essay on Humane Vitae. And this meant that I actually had to read it, which I had not ever done. And reading it was really striking because I knew from other researches and other writing that I had done that the document looks in retrospect to have been the most prophetic document of the 20th century. And in the essay for First Things, I walked through the document's predictions and I went through the empirical evidence showing that every one of them had come true.
Wow.
And it's really remarkable because, of course, what happened after Humane Vitae vindicated that document in ways that nobody could have foreseen at the time. That got me very interested in Catholic social teaching and more generally in the question of what is so wrong with our times. And that's a question that I have pursued in different ways, not because I'm a declinist, but because I think that after the sexual revolution, human beings came to live in ways that are very unnatural for our species. Living alone, living out of community, living apart from one another, broken homes, etc. And I feel the suffering out there, especially on the part of the young who are far more afflicted by these trends. And so what I've tried to do in my work, Simone, is honor that suffering by documenting it and arguing for a different way, an alternative way, including, of course, a Catholic way.
Yeah. Wow. To me, what's so beautiful about what you said is that your children and their friends, and then also just what's really going on out there, what's really wrong, what's the thing behind the thing. And to me, that sounds like spiritual motherhood. Like, okay, there's the problem that everybody kind of sees, but then like, what's the problem behind the problem that's really fueling all these symptoms? So I think there's genius in spiritual motherhood all over that. And I think that's so helpful because it's so, I think particularly for the feminine soul, it's so unsatisfying when you see a human person and so many suffering. Like we want to at least know why this is happening and what we can do. And I love that you, that article, because I think for me, I'm a Middle Eastern first generation American, and my parents moved here because of religious freedom issues. And I know you've written on religious freedom, which, gosh, that was another thing I wanted to talk to you about. We can't do it all, but the problem of religious freedom and coming here and then seeing that, like, okay, so like we're technically free here, but life isn't as good because it's not as much in community, because the hold of the sexual revolution has more dramatic symptoms in the United States. So like that's something I've always had to grapple with, is that like life here is more economically prosperous, and sure, I can go to mass without worrying about being martyred or persecuted the way that my parents were worried about it as teenagers growing up in Cairo. But on the other hand, their day-to-day life and existence was more religious, and culturally religious, and therefore it was better on a micro level at least. So that those are the difficult things to grapple with.
Yeah, there's a lot of confusion out there, Simone. And again, in writing about it, what I'm trying to do is expose it to the light.
Yeah.
So there's confusion, for example, because a lot of kids are being raised without a father in the home and don't have that model right before them.
Yeah.
But the confusion goes a lot deeper than just literal fatherlessness. There's also spiritual fatherlessness, the fact that so many young people are raised with no organized religion at all.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that people don't really grasp very well is that that takes you out of a relationship with a different kind of being. So we have literal fatherlessness, we have spiritual fatherlessness, and we have the fact that people are not as attached to place. There's a marked decline in patriotism in the United States. And in general, I think we're just less aware of our neighbors. Now, as Catholics, of course, one of the first things we're told is to take care of our neighbors. So there's a great disconnect between what the church teaches about the dignity of the human being and the necessity of community on the one hand, and the way many people are living in the United States and other Western countries. And this disconnect is making people miserable. It's not only imperiling them in other ways, but it's making them miserable in ways that are easily documented. For example, the rise in mental health problems among the young is, I argue in different places, a direct form of fallout of living apart from family, of not having enough social information. This is very basic stuff. In my latest book, Primal Screams, which we were talking about before recording, which I found, as you know, it looks like this.
Yes. Let's talk about that book, because I mean,
it's called Primal Screams: How the Sexual Revolution Created Identity Politics. And the argument of the book is that the entire Western world is in a crisis of identity. And when we see this fervor for identitarian groups based on gender, based on ethnicity, based on race, and we see all of these people, mostly young people in the public square, saying that they're victims of these things, they're victims of heteronormativity, or they're victims of racism, etc. My argument is that it's the collapse of natural communities that has led to this flight, this collective flight to identities based on victimhood. And I think, again, trying to honor the suffering out there, I think that many people today are indeed victims, but they're not victims of these abstractions that they point to, like heteronormativity, or other, feminism, other kinds of victim-based grievances. I think people are victims of the social trends since the 1960s that have shattered the natural communities that we are meant to live in. And so that cry of pain is real, which is why the book is called Primal Screams. But we need to disentangle the causes of these things, and that's part of what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, that's incredible. I was one of your lectures in Poland that really hurt me in a good way, but it hurt was when you said, we are a society without protection and without men. And I thought, wow, that is true. And that stuck with me all year. And we had this, webinar. We actually had a deacon on an Endow webinar this year on Humanae Vitae. We did a Humanae Vitae webinar. And one woman called in and said, just seeing the deacon that was the guest on the webinar was a healing experience, because she has no father, brother, uncle, husband and whatnot. And then your words came right back to me, where I thought, yeah, we are without protectors and without men. And that it hurt for me personally. And it hurt as I'm kind of noticing that happening in our own community. So fatherlessness. So how do we be mothers and spiritual mothers in a culture that is without men and without fathers? What can we?
I think we have to start by understanding the hunger out there. And so I know we've been talking about some pretty dark things, but there's a brighter side to this,
Yeah.
which is that people are looking for what they don't have. And often they don't understand it. I'll tell you a story that I always come back to, Simone. I gave a lecture on a campus several years ago, and a young woman came up afterwards, and she wanted to tell me her story. She was a Catholic convert from a very secular background. And I said, well, what brought you into the church? Was it theology? Was it sacred music? What was it? And I was pointing to these pretty abstract things. And she said, no, it was none of the above. It was that I was an only child, and I made friends in high school with a girl from a big Catholic family. And I found myself spending more and more time at their house because I wanted what they had. And that's why I became a Catholic.
Wow.
And I thought that was so moving, and so human. Yeah, it gives me goosebumps too. It still gives me goosebumps. But that's to say, what are Catholic women to do? Step in there and be that sister, be that aunt, be that cousin that people often don't have.
Yeah.
I mean, we're suffering from a very big self-inflicted wound. It's not just that families are more broken, they're also smaller.
Yeah.
A lot of people are growing up without siblings of the opposite sex.
Yeah.
And this is leading to, I believe, really impaired social learning. If you look at the animal kingdom, animals learn how to be what they are mainly by studying their siblings and their parents. And this is all very well documented. We just don't apply these truths to ourselves.
Yeah.
So in a world where people have fewer brothers, sisters, smaller extended families, this is a world in which there's a lot less social learning than used to exist before the sexual revolution. And I think it's having profound consequences. Yeah. And it leads us to a real paradox, Simone, because this generation of younger people maybe more, say, sexually experienced or knowledgeable than generations that came before it. But it's also more sexually illiterate in the sense that there isn't that knowledge acquired from studying members of one's family whom one can trust. And so again, we need to understand the nature of the problem out there. And that's what I find myself repeatedly trying to do. But part of understanding it is seeing that the Catholic Church, which gets such a bad rap for so many things, has actually been on the right side of all of these kinds of conflicts. And I think the church should get more credit for that than it does in our increasingly secular world.
Yes, to me, it's so stunning because we're in such a digital, activism. I have to do like big things age, but like that girl came into the church because she saw a happy family and she wanted that. And that's the greatest thing that we can do. And I think as it was, I mean, our conversation was so dark, but then, the light of the church and the light of Christianity and the light of Christ through our lives, God willing, is going to become ever greater. And I think we saw this throughout history. So I think there's for those of us who feel a little bit hopeless and dark, we should be very hopeful because in fact, it is really the down to earth beauty of the Christian life. And the family of the church, speaking of that hunger for belonging, I was just thinking the other day of Saint Perpetua and how, she was like a nursing mom in prison, and found the church her ultimate family and was willing to be brutally martyred for it. I mean, this is not somebody who struggled with who she was and where she belonged. She knew exactly who she was. She knew exactly who she belonged to. And even her own child and family wasn't strong enough to pull her away from the church and from Jesus. And that's pretty impressive. So, wow.
I think we can take this message about the vindication of Catholic teaching into the public square. This is what I try to do and also do not in my writing life, but just in my life as a middle-aged lady. So for example, I find when talking with young women, especially and including secular young women, if I make the point, look, who stands up against pornography these days? Pretty much only the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
That gets attention because deep down, almost every woman resents that stuff and understands it to be a threat. And you don't need religion to feel that way. And so I think we should try hard to connect those dots for people who, may not know that Catholic teaching is 1000% adamantly opposed to that stuff. And here's why. And it goes to the dignity of the individual. And again, there's nothing like that elevated vision of personhood out there in the secular public square. There's nothing. I mean, these kids go into the public square and they're told that, they can be kind of any gender they want to be, or they, everything's up for grabs. Everything is materialist. They're nothing but a collection of random atoms that came about somehow, and their death is going to be the end of everything. That's the secular story. That's right. What it offers. And that is such thin gruel for human beings. So we have the superior anthropological vision, and we just need to keep trying to put it out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where so much of your writing is so important because, it's if they're so unwilling, even through the experiences of misery, like, this like miserable state that this materialistic worldview, causes, even ignoring all the social science data because the ideology is just so strong that somehow all these rotten fruits of the sexual revolution are better somehow. At some point you have to think that there has to be this like rock bottom moment of actually, and I don't know what you've observed, but when I was a high school teacher, I thought, wow, without even really trying that hard, a lot of my students are pro-life and very pro-family because most of them came from cohabitating. I mean, I had this like shocking moment. This is how naive I was in that moment where, I'm talking about Catholic marriage and, all this theology of the body stuff. And, a student said to me, Miss Riz, this sounds like really great. It sounds great. I'm not going to lie, but I've never seen a couple that wasn't cohabitating. I've never seen a couple get married and have kids. He's never seen it. like with his own eyes. So all I was talking about was abstraction. But somehow I found that, in fact, they really wanted the abstraction that I think is the real life, is the Catholic proposal for the human person. So I don't know. What do you think is going to happen next? Maybe you're already researching it for your next book. Tell us, Mary, what's going to happen?
Oh, I wish I knew, but we can see what has happened. I mean, the entire planet has just been given a lesson about the importance of family, right? The entire planet in this COVID time
Yeah.
has been reminded every day of how much we need each other. And, you know, the Catholic Church has a script for that. And I think your point about marriage is great, Simone, because what we have to put out there is the idea that it's not supposed to be a luxury good. You know, you're not supposed to grow up in a world where the only people getting married are the people at the top of the socioeconomic ladder, which is increasingly what it's like. I mean, this is an everybody thing, and it corresponds to the desires of every human being. Once again, you know, the Catholic Church has an app for that, understands that better than anybody else. And I think that's again, beautiful, positive message to put out there.
Yeah. What do we say for our Endow women who are single, who might feel like collateral damage from the sexual revolution, and what kind of message of hope can we give to those women who are like, I was left behind, you know?
Yeah, I think everybody since 1960 is part of the collateral damage out there in one way or another.
Yeah.
Um, one analogy I use sometimes is I think we are like the American South before the end of the Civil War. And what I mean is we've got a whole society that's implicated. You know, there are good people, there are bad people, but pretty much everybody has been affected by this institution of the sexual revolution, say, as opposed to slavery back then. So everybody's implicated. And our redemption begins in understanding that we can transcend that. Again, I think there's a huge hunger out there, especially on the part of young people, for something better. They know that there's something deeply wrong with the way we're living. And I think we can start with that brokenness. You know, it's not like it was, I imagine, in the 1960s, when there was a triumphant feeling about sexual liberation, you know, and the pill was going to make marriage easier and make women more free and level the playing field. You can see why people would have thought that way. But 60 years after all of that, we can't ignore the problems that it's created. So we are, it's a sadder but wiser kind of people. And I have to think that for those ardent young women who are part of Endow, that there's an answer for you too in this, and in being the kind of sisters to each other, which I think is terribly important. I mean, I'll go with the feminists along that far. Like, sisterhood is powerful, sisterhood matters. We just need the right sisters.
Yes, absolutely. Wow. That's incredible. And I go back again to the early church in my mind, where this like blossoming of consecrated virgins, that was like the radical women's liberation movement in the early church, was consecrated virginity. It was like, wow, I have dignity as a woman. I'm gonna give that to Jesus, and I'm just gonna be free in that, because the government of the Roman Empire said that I was property. So I just think it's such a fascinating contrast is with the sexual revolution and like women's liberation being just, basically behaving in a way that women were forced to behave in, considered as property in the early church. And their liberation came from Jesus. And then they decided to consecrate their human dignity and their virginity to God. So I just think it's just incredible.
I'm glad that you mentioned that, Simone, because I think very often about how Christianity got to be what it is, and I've read different historical accounts of what really happened during the Roman Empire. And there's one that struck me especially by a Yale historian named Kenneth LaTourette, who was writing in the middle of the 20th century. And he reviewed lots of evidence. And he said, what turned this from a little tiny sect into a worldwide religion were basically two things that the Christians were doing. One, they had a stricter moral code than the society around them, and this caught attention. They had a stricter moral code even than the Judaism from which Christianity came. And there were people who were drawn to the religion because of it, and there was also curiosity on the part of other people because of it. That was one point. And the other was, he said, the way they took care of one another, the way the Christians living in community took care of people they were not related to, except by virtue of their religion. So those, I think, are two lessons that we should think about probably every day as we live in this society that is more and more opposed to what Christianity stands for. We need to hold on to both those things, the solidarity with others and the importance of that moral code. It's not just incidental to Christianity, it's essential.
It's essential, and it's freedom, and it's flourishing, and it's happiness, and it's I'm thinking about my Egyptian dad, who's when he doesn't have all these like deep theological intellectual things to say about modernity and all that, but he'll just sit in his chair and just go, it's just not fun anymore, it's just not fun anymore. There's just like this lack of carefree lightheartedness that comes with actually a strict moral code. And I think that's the paradox of it all. It's just not fun anymore. So that's my dad's big line that cracks me up. But he's right. When freedom became license, we lost all the fun. And Christians are the ones who are still enjoying that and can bring it back and bring people into it. And I love that you said that. And this is always my prayer and my hopes for women in Endow groups, is that accessing the intellectual inheritance of the church is going to be like launching pads for bringing theology to life, caring for our neighbors, basically the way of truth, entering into the way of the good, which is just so much more, I think, convincing, especially in this like kind of anti-truth time. So anyway, well, it was so good talking to you today, Mary. Anything else you'd like to share about, I'm a sanguine ENFP personality, so I want to jump to a million different things because I just love so much of everything that you write. So
thank you, Simone. Maybe we'll have a return visit sometime and catch up on some other fronts.
Okay, that would be very good. Thank you, Mary. And I'll link to everything in the podcast and the YouTube channel.
Great. Thanks very much.